Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Identity Talks. Today, we have our Chief Product Officer, Paul Trulove, back on, and he's going to share a little bit about what we do best, which is identity. So, Paul, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Glad to be back.
So, it's no secret that SailPoint is a leader and an innovator in identity. But when you're talking to potential customers and people who are exploring implementing SailPoint themselves, I'm sure you've heard the question, why SailPoint? So, can you just answer that question for us?
Look, identity is a long game. It is a big project. In fact, it's a program at most organizations, and I think you have to look at it through that lens. And so, working with a company like SailPoint, who really is on its second generation of identity management in terms of the expertise that we've brought together to apply to this problem space, is really critical. The depth of knowledge we have, particularly in the enterprise space around how identity works, not just with a simple set of applications, but with some of the most complex systems in the enterprise, is really critical to helping organizations be successful in not only solving today's identity problems, but also tomorrow's. The second thing is a proven track record of innovation. This is a market that needs constant disruption because of the complexity of managing access to a growing number of systems that no longer reside inside the data center. So SailPoint started out with a vision that was disruptive. Let's go figure out a better way to do identity management versus the basic user administration scenarios that we're playing out in many organizations. And we've been able to constantly disrupt ourselves through applying new information and new knowledge, and really just that spirit of changing the way that people look at identity so that it can become easier, more organizations can take advantage of it, and it really becomes a building block of how the company works. And then the third thing is about customer success. The reality is the identity landscape is littered with failed projects. And so one of the things that SailPoint started out doing differently was paying attention to whether customers were being successful, not just 6 months after they started the project, but a year, 2 years, 5 years, and even in some cases, 10 years down the road. And that commitment to customer success is something that I think is absolutely critical and has been critical to SailPoint success, over the course of the last decade plus that we've been doing this. Because at the end of the day, if you select a vendor that's not there with you day in and day out, the likelihood of your project failing is significantly higher.
So, what about the analysts? What do they have to say?
Yeah, Hannah, that's a great point. The analyst community, Gartner, Forrester, Kuppinger, Cole, and others are, I think, an important part of the evaluation process because the reality is they talk to hundreds, if not thousands, of customers, over the course of time and really have a good perspective of how well customers are doing with certain vendors and some of the things that you need to watch out for. So whether you're reading the major reports or looking at something like Gartner's Peer Insights, you'll get a better perspective, both from the analyst community, but also from the customers that participate in something like Gartner Peer Insights, where it's really just customer feedback. And the one thing I'll say about that particular report is, SailPoint's the only IGA vendor that actually made the Gartner Peer Insight report because of our ability, again, to balance that innovation and that customer success, but particularly on the customer success side.
Well, I know you're the right person to ask these questions to, Paul. So, the next question is when you're talking with a potential customer, how do you guide them when they are asking for advice on how to evaluate SailPoint versus other IGA vendors?
So the first thing I tell them is check the facts. Not all identity governance vendors are created equal. We all have a different track record, and that track record is really important, both from the perspective of the product, but also the broader company. So I start by, making sure that you do your due diligence all the way through the process. And part of that due diligence isn't just looking at the product. It's talking to reference customers for the vendors themselves. And the key thing when you're looking at references is, make sure that you're talking to customers that have a long-term success with the product in the company, not a short-term one. The reality is, when customers go through vendor selection, they often come out with really, they're excited. They've made a selection and they're ready to move forward. And so if you talk to a customer that's just made a purchase decision, they will give you a very different perspective than somebody that's actually been in the trenches working with the product, working with the vendor for several years, and has gone through those periods where things have maybe gone wrong. And they'll know whether you'll know in those conversations whether the vendor really stands behind what it commits during the sales process, or whether all of a sudden those features become vaporware and they maybe don't come to fruition the way that you're expecting them to. So those references are really, really important, but you've got to make sure you check references with people that you know have seen the entire scope of experience with a product and a vendor, not just that initial sales implementation. The other thing that I say is, go through and understand, what the vendor means by innovation. Are they just using the latest buzzwords, or have they really embraced some of the new technologies, the new approaches? They've gone through the analysis and understand, how to wield those capabilities. And AI and machine learning are great examples of that. Those are big buzzwords in every security company out there and every identity company out there. But understanding exactly how the vendor's using that technology and really how they're going to apply it, not just today but going into the future, is very important. And basically it comes down to that old adage, trust but verify, because the reality is your job may be on the line for this decision, and you want to make sure that you're not only accepting the vendor on face value, you're really doing the fact checking required to make the right decision.
Well, I think that about sums it up for us today here. So, if you would like to watch more from Paul and other SailPoint and identity experts, you can head over to sailpoint.com. And until next time, this has been Identity Talks.